Humanism on, I'm sorry. Okay. Everybody's ready?
Ready.
Okay. The Scopes Monkey Trial, Humanism on Trial. And the source of my information for this presentation is from the book, the cover of which you see Trial of the Century. This is a quintessential presentation for a humanist club, quintessential. So, what's the context of this trial? In 1924, the state of Tennessee enacted the Butler Act, which act read as follows: it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the public schools of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man descended from a lower order of animals. The intention of the law was to ban the teaching of evolution in public schools, which theory of man's origin Christian fundamentalists considered blasphemous and contrary to the Bible. In the 1920s, there were at least 13 states in the United States that had anti-evolution statutes, like the state of Tennessee. So, why was the Butler Act allegedly unconstitutional? The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, claimed the Butler Act was unconstitutional because it imposed religious doctrine in the public schools and broke the separation of church and state. The unconstitutionality had to do with the Tennessee Constitution, not the federal Constitution. That didn't come about until 50 years later, where the U.S. Supreme Court addressed the issues in this case. Section 3, Article 1 of the Tennessee State Constitution reads, "No preference shall ever be given by law to any religious establishment. In layman's term, that means the state government shall not by statute favor any religious doctrine." So, what did the ACLU do? It requested a high school science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, John T. Scopes, to be the defendant in a test case challenging the legality of the anti-evolution statute. And here we have a picture of John T. Scopes. He was 25 years old. He was a science teacher and a football coach. So, why is it called the Trial of the Century, which is the title of the book from which I'm getting my information? One was the fame of the lawyers involved. Clarence Darrow represented the defendant, John Scopes, at trial. Darrow was probably the most famous lawyer of his time and represented Scopes. He was the champion of the underdog. His most famous trial before the Scopes trial was defending the murderers, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, who had murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks. Darrow convinced the jury not to give his clients the death penalty. This was considered a victory for Darrow. William Jennings Bryan represented the state of Tennessee. He was well known. Bryan had been the Democratic nominee for president 3 times, 1896, 1900, and 1908, and had been Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. Just parenthetically, he resigned his Secretary of State position in 1915 because Bryan was a dyed-in-wool pacifist, and he believed going to war, which Woodrow Wilson eventually did, is something that he didn't want to be part of the administration who did that. Bryan was the most famous Christian evangelist of the early 20th century and was a dogmatic proponent that the Bible should be interpreted literally as the inerrant Word of God. Bryan had not tried a case in court for 36 years. So, why is it called the Trial of the Century? One, the fame of the lawyers involved. What's the other reason it's considered considered trial of the century. The issue in controversy enthralled the nation. Which theory is correct, evolution or creationism? And creationism is referring to Genesis in the Bible, that God created man, also called intelligent design, ID for short. The legal issues involved in the Scopes trial, e.g. is this statute constitutional? Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Were quickly eclipsed as the trial became a circus pitting science against the Bible. To the public, the Scopes trial asked whether man was created by God or did he descend from a monkey. Let's step back a moment. In 1925, what was the big picture in the U.S. in which the Scopes monkey trial took place? In the wake of World War I, which at that time obviously was called the Great War, 20 million soldiers and civilians were killed. Another 20 to 40 million persons were wounded or maimed for life. Until World War I happened, German philosophers such as Immanuel Kant and Georg Hegel in the 19th century were convinced that human history was unfolding rationally and that man was on the road to moral betterment. There were no global wars in the 19th century, and there was some thinking at that time that we're getting better and better, and war is going out. We're not going to have future wars. However, the Great War, World War I, was incredibly traumatic to the United States, and it shattered the belief that history was unfolding rationally and that man was on the road to moral betterment. If God existed, how could he have let World War I happen? If God did not exist, how will we support our ethics and prevent future wars? So, in the context of the early 20th century after World War I, for Brian, the Scopes trial was about buttressing and supporting our ethics with a religious underpinning. If God didn't exist, we were, according to Brian, ethically rudderless. That's why this talk is so appropriate for a humanist club. The trial was a circus, but the Scopes trial is not remembered for that. A little bit of background about the small town of Dayton, Tennessee, where the trial took place. Dayton, Tennessee was 1 mile long and 6 blocks wide. The chief industry in the town was coal mining, but the coal ran out. The town was shrinking and becoming destitute. The hub of the town was centered in Frank Robinson's drugstore. It was where people congregated to gossip, to have coffee, and to socialize. Robinson was the person who came up with the idea of the Scopes monkey trial, wherein he hoped to create business and attract investors to his shrinking town. So, how do you attract visitors to your town? Well, you create a circus. And so Robinson had Joe Mendy, the monkey, come to the trial. People paid money to be photographed with this monkey who rode a pony, drank Coke from a glass, and played the piano. And here he is smoking a pipe. What else was going on? Well, hundreds of monkey dolls were sold to spectators. What else? You also had anti-evolution books were sold demonizing defendant John Scopes. Further, to attract visitors to your town, you made it a circus, but you also wanted to make certain that everybody in the country knew about it. This trial was the first trial that was ever nationally publicized So, news of the Scopes trial was reported in hundreds of newspapers, radio talk shows, and magazines throughout the United States and Britain. And here we have a picture of the trial. That's Clarence Darrow here, where my arrow is pointing. Over 4,000 spectators and 200 reporters attended the trial. There was so much demand for information that reporters were filing 7 reports a day regarding this trial, which only lasted 8 days. Judge Ralston, the judge, feared that the floor was going to collapse because the courtroom was on the 2nd floor of the building of the courthouse. Consequently, he moved it outside. Plus, he moved it because it was brutally hot in July. This was July 10th through July 21st. And of course, there was no air conditioning back then. So he moved it outside so the 4,000 spectators and 200 reporters could attend and watch the trial there. And here we have Clarence Darrow on the left and William Jennings Bryan on the right. So, the Scopes trial was a circus, but it's not remembered for that. It is also not remembered for its legal reasoning. The bias of Judge Ralston. He disallowed all defense witnesses, that is to say witnesses that Darrow wanted to call on behalf of John T. Scopes. He disallowed all defense witnesses who would have testified that Darwinian evolution was supported by science, and he disallowed it because he considered such evidence blasphemous. Now, can you imagine any judge doing that today? I think not. Further, he held that the anti-evolution statute did not violate the Tennessee Establishment Clause in its Constitution, which clause prohibits the state from enacting any statute that favors religion. The jury returned a verdict against Scopes in 11 minutes, upholding the validity of the state statute, the constitutionality of the state statute, and fined him $100. The ACLU appealed the conviction to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which court upheld the conviction and the constitutionality of the Butler statute. The Butler Act remained in force for the next 45 years in Tennessee. This reasoning, that is to say that anti-evolution statutes were constitutional and did not violate the Establishment Clause of the state constitution, was finally addressed by the U.S. Supreme Court, considering the Federal Establishment Clause, the federal constitution, and overruled this line of reasoning. So it wasn't until 1968 when the U.S. Supreme Court said, nope, that doesn't make any sense. These anti-evolution statutes violate the Establishment Clause of the federal constitution. So, if the trial is not remembered because it was a circus, and it's not remembered because the court's poor legal reasoning, i.e. excluding witnesses because their testimony is blasphemous, how has history remembered the Scopes monkey trial? The trial is remembered as the battle between tradition and modernity. And by modernity, folks, that means us, humanism. So you had the Holy Bible versus the ascent of the modernists. This was a popular cartoon in the 1920s, and it's sarcastic, it's derogatory. And I know you can't read it in the back, so let me read it for you. You have at the bottom of the stair steps, Christianity, and the next you have Bible not infallible. Next you have man not made in God's image. Next you have no miracles. Next you have no virgin birth. Next you have no deity. Next you have no atonement. Next you have no resurrection. And the final step, you have agnosticism. Our club in the 1920s would have been a very subversive and unpopular club. The trial provided a platform pitting the logic of science and education against God's word as recorded in the Bible. Most importantly, the Scopes trial took place in the context of a moral crisis following World War I. Was religion without ethics, without religion, is ethics sustainable? Is this trial relevant today? And here outside the city of Dayton, Tennessee, we have the Scopes trial. Let me read this for you. Here from July 10th to the 21st, 1925, John Thomas Scopes, a county high school teacher, was tried for teaching that man descended from a lower order of animals in violation of a lately passed state law. That's the anti-evolution statute. William Jennings Bryan, Assistant Prosecution Clarence Darrow, Arthur Garfield, Hayes and Dudley Field Malone, the defense. Scopes was convicted. The issue is as alive today as it was in 1925. 30 to 40% of Americans today still reject the validity of evolution as a correct theory of man's origin and consider the story of Genesis in the Bible to be factually and historically correct. The end of our story, the denouement. What happened to the players after the trial? William Jennings Bryan died 4 days after the trial, a broken man. He died in Dayton, Tennessee at the age of 65. Clarence Darrow was 68 when he represented Scopes. He continued to practice law and to defend the underdog for the rest of his life. He's considered one of America's most talented and brilliant trial lawyers. He died of heart disease in 1938 at the age of 80 after he wrote his autobiography. John T. Scopes never escaped his legacy as the defendant in the monkey trial. He was lampooned and accused of being morally corrupt and an instrument of Satan. He received many death threats from evangelists who wanted to hang him or burn him alive. After the trial, he left teaching, obtained a degree in geology, and worked for an oil company in Venezuela, frankly, to get out of the United States and the reputation he had.
Probably did a lot better.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, you said that. You're right. Whoever said that. Yeah. In 1970, he died of cancer at the age of 70, 3 months also after he wrote his autobiography. Just parenthetically, he had applied to get a PhD either in teaching, which was his first love, or in geology. And because of his reputation, his applications to be a PhD student was at the University of Chicago were rejected, and one of the administrators wrote on his rejection letter, "Take your atheistic marbles and go play elsewhere." Really? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Okay, Judge Ralston, what happened to him? He was not reelected to the bench in 1926, and he ran for governor but lost badly. He suffered a nervous breakdown in 1950, was confined to his home as an invalid, and died in 1956 at the age of 87. An excellent biography that I just finished is this one here that you see. And unfortunately, people have simplistically stereotyped the Scopes trial as a dichotomy of two choices. Either you believe in intelligent design, i.e. God created man, and are a theist, or you believe that through Darwinian evolution, man descended from a monkey and an atheist. Unfortunately, that's how people remember the Scopes trial. However, why is the Scopes trial cited so often? It had as many issues as a porcupine has quills. For instance, the most obvious is the separation of church and state. And the Scopes trial is the grandfather case interpreting the establishment clause of the Constitution. So it's cited for that issue. What else? It's cited for academic freedom. Your teachers have the freedom to teach scientific ideas if they conflict with religious or political belief. What other issue? State power over education. Can the government, in our case the state of Tennessee, use public schools to promote religious doctrine by suppressing scientific teaching? Another issue, the curriculum of what is taught. Who controls the curriculum for students? The state or the individual teachers? What's another issue? Use of criminal law to enforce morality. The anti-evolution statute sought to eliminate immoral thinking by criminalizing it. It was a criminal misdemeanor. And specifically, the immoral thinking was that man evolved from a lower form of life. It's also interesting, of course, in 1920s when the 18th Amendment was adopted by the U.S. states, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol, and its purpose was to eliminate immoral behavior, which was drinking. So using a criminal statute at this time to eliminate immoral behavior or thinking was something that was common. Questions for discussion, which is all of you will discuss here in a minute. I'm going to leave this slide up on the PowerPoint. 1, what are examples of beliefs that may not be provable by evidence, but are still psychologically or morally necessary to live a meaningful life? For instance, the belief that man can morally better himself and that he is becoming better and better. We can't prove that with evidence, but that may be a belief that encourages moral behavior. So it's something that is psychologically appropriate or morally necessary. 2, should science ever be limited by community beliefs? For instance, assume that we can manipulate the human genome scientifically and create children, all of whom have an IQ of 140. Should science be allowed to do that? Or is there a community belief that says, no, we need to limit what science is doing? Just an example. You'll think of your own examples. Number 3, how would you react to an effort to put ID, intelligent design, into your public school science? Number 4, what counts as truth and who decides?
That's what I'll say it is.
I'm sorry, did I miss something?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So, that's the conclusion of the presentation on the Scopes monkey trial.
Can we add to number 3 the 10 Commandments? Because that's actually happening in certain states.
That's,
So you might want to add that to your discussion, the 10 Commandments in schools.
okay, just a minute, we're gonna,
Okay,
hang
good.
on. Jim,
Okay, you join your discussion groups, and we get about 15 minutes or so of discussion time, and then we'll bring it back to Scott, and we'll find out what you came up with. You have to